You know, they say that some houses are born bad, that the stones themselves drink up the misery of the people living inside them. But sometimes the badness doesn't start with the house. It starts with the blood. It starts in the womb, a little poison passed down from mother to daughter, a darkness that sits in the heart like a sleeping spider, just waiting to wake up. Sit close now. The fire is warm, but this story is cold. It is the story of Christine and Léa Papin, and before they were the monsters of France, before they were the wolves that the newspapers screamed about, they were just little girls. But oh, they were never just little girls. They were broken things, right from the start. Their story begins in the mud and the rain of Le Mans in the early 1900s. Their father, Gustave, was a man who found his courage at the bottom of a bottle, a drunkard, a weak man. But the mother, Clemence was the nightmare. She was a woman with a heart like a closed fist. She didn't look at her children with love. She looked at them and saw burdens. She saw mistakes. There was a curse in the Papin blood, you see. It wasn't magic, it was madness. Their uncle had hanged himself. A cousin had been locked away in an asylum, screaming at walls that wouldn't answer. The madness was a silent guest at their dinner table, watching them eat, waiting for its turn. The first tragedy wasn't even Christine or Léa. It was their big sister, Emilia. Poor, sweet Emilia. When she was just a child, the father, Gustave, in his drunken sickness, did terrible, unspeakable things to her. And what did the mother do? Did she hold her child? Did she weep? No. Clemence looked at her ruined daughter and blamed her. She said Emilia had seduced him. Can you imagine the coldness of a soul like that? She threw Emilia into the Bon Pastor orphanage, a place of stone walls and iron discipline, to wash away a sin that wasn't hers. Emilia eventually ran to the convent, becoming a nun just to escape the family name, disappearing into the black habit like a ghost. And then there were the two left behind, Christine and Léa. Clemence didn't want them either. She gave Christine away to an aunt and uncle when she was a baby. For 7 years, Christine was happy. She was loved. She forgot the smell of gin and the sound of her mother's sharp voice. But happiness was not allowed for the Papin girls. When the aunt's husband died, Clemence came back like the Grim Reaper to claim her property. She snatched Christine back, not to love her, but to control her. She took little Léa, too, who had been living with an uncle. And where did she put them? She didn't take them home to a warm bed. She threw them into the same orphanage that had swallowed their sister. Bon Pastor, the Good Shepherd. It was a cold, hard place. The nuns were strict. The days were long. But it was there, in the silence of the dormitory, in the shadows of the chapel, that something shifted. Christine, the older one, the stronger one, looked at little Léa. Léa was quiet, slow, terrifyingly introverted. Christine saw herself in Léa's eyes. They were alone in the world. The father was a drunk ghost. The mother was a tyrant who only visited to demand they work harder, to demand their future wages. They realized then that they had no one but each other. The world was a mouth trying to eat them, and their mother was the teeth. Christine became the mother Léa never had. She became the father, the protector, the god. And Léa? Léa became the shadow. They stopped being two separate girls. They began to merge. They held hands so tight their knuckles turned white. They whispered in corners, a language of glances and touches that no one else understood. They were building a wall, brick by brick, shutting out the nuns, shutting out the mother, shutting out the light. Clemence thought she was raising servants. She thought she was raising girls who would scrub floors and send her the money. She didn't. No, she was raising a two-headed monster. She didn't know that by squeezing them so hard, she was fusing them together. When they left the orphanage, they weren't ready for the world. They were only ready for each other. They were like deep-sea creatures, made for the dark, high-pressure depths. And when you bring a creature like that up to the surface, well, sometimes it explodes. But not yet. First, they had to work. First, they had to learn to hate the world properly. They moved through the streets of Le Mans like shadows cast by the same tree. You could pass them on the sidewalk and never truly see them. They wore heavy coats, their heads bowed against the wind, their eyes fixed on the pavement. If you did happen to catch a glimpse of their faces, you would see a strange, blank mask. It wasn't peace. It was a wall that said, "We are not of your world." By the time they were young women, the die was cast. The orphanage had released them, but they had simply traded one prison for another. They entered the service of the bourgeois families of France, the wealthy households that needed floors scrubbed and silver polished. But Christine and Léa were not like the other maids. Other maids would gossip in the markets. They would flirt with the delivery boys, steal a nip of sherry when the master wasn't looking, or dream of a husband who would take them away from the life of servitude. Not the Papin sisters. They had no dreams of husbands. They had no interest in the world of men. Men were dangerous. Men were drunkards like their father, or aloof masters who looked through them. No, their entire universe had shrunk down to the size of a single room, the room they shared. They made a pact, silent but unbreakable. They would only work in houses where they could be together. It was unusual, demanding for two young maids to dictate terms, but they were good at what they did. They were terrifyingly good. They cleaned with a fury that bordered on obsession. They didn't just wipe away dust. They attacked it. They scrubbed until their knuckles were raw, until the wood groaned under their brushes. Employers loved them at first. Who wouldn't want invisible servants who worked like machines and never asked for time off? But the other servants, they knew. They sensed the wrongness. The sisters didn't speak at dinner. They ate quickly, eyes on their plates, and the moment the last bite was swallowed, they would retreat. Up the stairs, into their attic room, and the door would click shut. Inside that room, the silence broke. But it wasn't the chatter of sisters sharing secrets. It was something deeper. Christine would speak, and Léa would listen. Christine was the priestess, and Léa was the congregation. Christine decided what they thought, what they felt, what they hated. Léa simply absorbed it. It was as if Léa had hollowed herself out, scooped out her own personality, just to make room for Christine's soul. They slept in the same bed. Always. Even when there were two beds available. In the morning, the second one would be untouched, the sheets perfectly smooth. They curled together like puppies in a basket, seeking heat, seeking safety. It was a closeness that made people uncomfortable to think about. It was the intimacy of survivors on a life raft, convinced the ocean was full of sharks. And the biggest shark was still Clements. Their mother was still there, hovering at the edge of their lives. She didn't visit to hug them. She visited to collect. Every month, the sisters would take their hard-earned wages, money earned on their knees, scrubbing filth, and hand it over to Clements. She took it with a sniff of disdain, as if it were her due, as if she owned them. Christine, usually so fierce, so dominant with Léa, would crumble before her mother. She wanted Clements to love her. It was a desperate, pathetic hunger. She would buy Clements gifts, trying to buy a smile, trying to buy a well done. But Clements was a black hole. Nothing could fill her. She took the money, she took the gifts, and she gave nothing back but cold criticism. This rejection festered in Christine's belly. It turned into a hard, hot stone of rage. But she couldn't let it out at her mother. You can't attack the God you worship, even if it's a cruel God. So, she swallowed the rage. She fed it to Léa. They nurtured this hatred together. They began to look at the world with suspicion. Everyone was an enemy. The shopkeeper who looked at them too long? Enemy. The employer who checked the dust on the mantelpiece? Enemy. On their days off, Sunday afternoons, they didn't go to the cinema or the dance halls. They dressed in their finest, severe clothes and walked. They walked in perfect step, arm in arm, a closed circuit. They walked to church, sat in the back, prayed to a God who remained silent, and then walked home. They spoke to no one. If someone greeted them, they would hurry past, heads down, terrified that the outside world might contaminate them. They were building a pressure cooker. They were sealing all the vents. The love they had for each other was so intense it was suffocating, and the hate they had for everyone else was growing like mold in a damp cellar. They were perfect, quiet, efficient little machines. But machines don't have feelings. And these two, they were feeling too much. They were feeling everything. And then, in 1926, they found the perfect place to hide. A big house, a quiet street, a family that wanted perfection. They found the Lancelin house, and the trap was set. It was 1926 when the iron gates of number 6 Rue Bruyère swung open to swallow them. To the casual observer, it was a respectable house in a respectable neighborhood of Le Mans. It was a place of high walls and shuttered windows, a fortress of bourgeois privacy. But for Christine and Léa, it was a sanctuary. It was a place where they could disappear. The masters of the house were the Lancelins. Monsieur René Lancelin was a retired solicitor, a man of quiet authority who moved through life with the detached air of someone who has already seen enough. He was rarely home, and when he was a ghost in his own hallway. Courteous, distant, barely registering the existence of the maids who polished his shoes. But the women were the gravity of the house. Madame Léonie Lancelin. She was a woman of heavy presence, both physically and spiritually. She suffered from nerves, that polite Victorian term for a darkness of the mind that made her prone to deep, suffocating depressions. She was exacting. She was precise. She ran her home with the rigidity of a military commander. A speck of dust on the mantel was a personal insult. A wrinkle in the bedsheet was a declaration of war. And then there was the daughter, Genevieve. 27 years old, but she seemed younger, trapped in a suspended adolescence. She was her mother's shadow, tethered to Léonie by an invisible umbilical cord that had never been cut. She had no job, no husband, no life of her own. She simply existed in her mother's orbit, echoing her moods, validating her complaints. Into this stifling atmosphere walked the Papin sisters. They were hired as a pair, of course. Christine as the cook, Léa as the chambermaid. And from the very first day, they were a revelation. Madame Lancelin had never seen anything like it. They didn't just work. They performed a ritual of cleanliness. They moved through the rooms with a terrifying efficiency. They spoke to no one. They asked for nothing. They ate the leftovers of the family's meals in the kitchen, standing up or huddled quickly at the table before vanishing upstairs. They were the pearls of Le Mans. That's what the Lancelins told their friends at dinner parties. We have the most extraordinary maids, they would boast. You never hear them. You never see them. The house simply cleans itself. But the house was not cleaning itself. It was being scrubbed by two women who were slowly erasing their own humanity. The sisters created a world within a world. The Lancelins lived downstairs, in the light, surrounded by heavy furniture and ticking clocks. The sisters lived upstairs, in the attic room under the eaves. It was a small, cramped space, freezing in the winter and stifling in the summer. But it was theirs. It was the only place on earth where they could take off the masks. In that room, they would whisper. They would analyze every interaction with the ladies downstairs. Christine, ever the paranoid guardian, would dissect Madame Lancelin's glances. "Did you see how she looked at the silver?" she would hiss. "She thinks we are stealing. She is watching us, Léa. Always watching." Léa, wide-eyed and submissive, would nod. "Yes, Christine. She hates us." It wasn't true, not really. Madame Lancelin was demanding, yes, but she was likely indifferent to them as people. To her, they were appliances. But in the vacuum of the sisters' minds, silence was interpreted as hostility. A lack of praise was seen as a silent threat. For 6 years, this clockwork life continued. 6 years of absolute, terrifying routine. Waking before dawn, the cold water on their faces, the smell of floor wax and roasting meat. The silence. Oh, the silence of that house was heavy. It pressed against your eardrums. The sisters stopped talking to the Lancelins entirely. Orders were given on small slips of paper or with a nod. The verbal communication withered away until there was nothing left but the sound of brooms and the clinking of china. They were paid well. They saved every franc, dreaming of a day they could buy a house in the country and live together forever, with no masters, no mothers, no men. But the walls of number 6 Rue Bruyère were closing in. The perfection they maintained was brittle. It was a sheet of glass under too much pressure. Christine, in particular, was beginning to fray. The nerves of the mistress were seeping into the maid. Christine began to see signs that weren't there. She thought the mayor was plotting against them. She thought the Lancelins were secretly mocking them. The Lancelins, in their arrogance, saw nothing. They saw clean floors. They saw iron shirts. They didn't look closely at the eyes of the women who served their soup. If they had, they might have seen the flat, dead look of a predator waiting in the tall grass. They might have realized that they were not living with servants. They were living with 2 feral animals who had been forced into aprons, and the cage was getting too small. The pearls were beginning to crack. And when pearls crack, they leave sharp edges. 7 years. Can you imagine holding your breath for 7 years? That is what life became inside 6 Rue Bruyère. The air grew stale, recycled over and over until it was thick with unspoken resentments. The Lancelin house, once a sanctuary, had transformed into a pressure cooker, and the heat was being turned up degree by agonizing degree. As the years ground on, Madame Lancelin's nerves worsened. The depression that shadowed her deepened, and like many people who feel they are losing control of their own minds, she sought to control her environment with tyrannical precision. Her eyes became sharper. Her tongue became harder. She was no longer just the employer. She was the warden. The sisters called her the patron. They didn't say it with respect. They whispered it with a mix of terror and venom. The ritual of the white glove began to haunt their dreams. It wasn't always a literal glove, but the spirit of it was there. Madame would descend the stairs, her face set in a mask of grim determination. She would walk into a room that Christine and Léa had spent hours scrubbing, a room that smelled of lemon and wax, and she would find the one thing they had missed. A single thread on the carpet. a smudge on a window pane that only caught the light at a certain angle. She wouldn't shout. Shouting would have been human. Shouting implies passion. No, she would simply point. She would look at the flaw, then look at the sisters, her silence screaming that they were incompetent, that they were ungrateful, that they were dirt. Christine took these criticisms like knife wounds. Remember, Christine was the mother, the protector. When Madame Lancelin criticized their work, she wasn't just critiquing a cleaning job. She was attacking their worth. She was attacking the little world they had built. Christine began to shake physically when Madame entered the room. Her hands would tremble so violently she had to hide them behind her apron. "She is watching us, Léa," Christine would hiss in the dark of their attic room. "She wants to catch us out. She wants to send us back to the orphanage. She wants to separate us." That was the core of the fear. Separation. It was the only thing that terrified them more than death. They believed, with the irrational certainty of the mad, that the Lancelins were plotting to split them up. Every criticism was a step toward that separation. Every cold look was a threat to their union. Léa, poor simple Léa, absorbed Christine's paranoia like a sponge. If Christine said the mistress was a demon, then she was a demon. If Christine said they were under siege, then they were soldiers in a trench. The isolation became absolute. They cut ties with their mother, Clemence. The visits stopped. The letters stopped. They had no family left but each other. They had no friends. They spoke to no shopkeepers. The only human voices they heard were the commands of Madame Lancelin and the mindless chatter of Genevieve. And Genevieve, she was almost worse. She was the passive accomplice. She stood by her mother, silent, nodding, watching. To the sisters, she was a second pair of eyes, a second judge. They hated her with a quiet, seething intensity. They hated her soft hands, her idle life, her complicity in their humiliation. One day, Christine found a piece of paper on the floor. It was a scrap of trash, nothing more. But Madame Lancelin saw it. She made Christine get on her knees to pick it up. On her knees. Like a dog. Christine did it. She lowered herself, her face burning, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She picked up the scrap, but as she rose, something in her eyes had changed. The submissiveness was gone, replaced by a cold, hard glint. It was the look of a bridge that has finally snapped, the cables whipping in the wind. The house was so quiet in those final months, but it was the silence of a fuse burning down. The Lancelins sat in their parlor, reading their papers, eating their dinners, completely unaware that just above their heads, in the cramped attic, two women were slowly, methodically going insane. Christine began to hear voices, not just the whispers of her sister, but voices in the walls, voices in the wind. They told her to be ready. They told her to defend Léa. They told her that the time was coming. It is strange, isn't it? How you can live in a house with someone, share the same air, and exist in completely different realities. The Lancelins thought they were living in a well-ordered bourgeois home. The Papin sisters knew they were living in a battlefield. And then came February. February is a cruel month. The days are short, the nights are long and black. The cold seeps into the bones. On February 2nd, 1933, the sun rose over Le Mans just like any other day. But the shadows were longer that day. The darkness was hungry. The pressure cooker was vibrating on the stove, and the lid was about to blow off. February 2nd, 1933. A Thursday. The sky hung low and heavy over Le Mans, a gray blanket that smothered the light long before sunset. It was a day that felt like it was holding its breath. Inside the house at Rue Bruyere, the air was still. Too still. Monsieur Lancelin was gone, attending to his business. Madame Lancelin and Genevieve had left in the afternoon, dressing in their furs to visit relatives, perhaps do a little shopping. They left the house in the care of their pearls. They expected to return to a warm dinner, a clean table, and the quiet subservience they had paid for. They had no idea they were walking out of a home and into a tomb. Christine was in the utility room, ironing. It was a mundane task, one she had done 1,000 times. The heavy electric iron hissed as it glided over the linen, smoothing out the wrinkles of a life she would never live. Léa was nearby, moving like a ghost, tidying, waiting for instructions. The rhythm of the house was unbroken. Hiss, glide, fold, hiss, glide, fold. And then, the universe snapped. It wasn't a thunderclap. It was a small, sharp pop. The electric iron, perhaps faulty, perhaps just old, short-circuited. In an instant, the current surged and died. The lights in the house flickered once, a desperate gasp of electricity, and then blackness. The fuse had blown. The house plunged into a sudden, unnatural twilight. It was only late afternoon, but the winter gloom outside meant the interior was now swallowed by shadows. The hum of the refrigerator stopped. The hiss of the iron fell silent. The silence that followed was absolute. For a normal person, this is an annoyance. You find a candle. You find the fuse box. You fix it. You laugh about it later. But you must remember, Christine Papin was not a normal person. She was a woman walking on a tightrope over a pit of fire. To her, this wasn't an accident. It was a catastrophe. She stood there in the dim light, the cooling iron in her hand, and terror washed over her. Cold, paralyzing terror. She thought of Madame Lancelin. She thought of the inspections. She thought of the white glove. If a speck of dust could cause a lecture, what would a broken iron and a dark house cause? In Christine's shattered mind, the blown fuse was a declaration of war. She imagined the Lancelins returning. She imagined the door opening. She imagined the anger on the patron's face. She will yell. She will blame us. She will separate us. Léa, she whispered. The sound was loud in the dead house. Léa came to her side, trembling. She felt Christine's fear radiating off her like heat. The lights, Christine. The lights are gone. She will be angry, Christine said, her voice flat, devoid of hope. She will come back, and it will be dark. She will never forgive us. They didn't try to fix the fuse. They didn't run to the neighbors for help. The logic of the outside world no longer applied here. Instead, they did something that chills the blood. They decided to wait. They moved out of the utility room and into the hallway. The house was a cavern of shadows now, the furniture looming like sleeping beasts. They climbed the stairs. Not to their room. No, they didn't hide in their room. They stopped on the landing of the first floor. They stood there in the semi-darkness, shoulder to shoulder, breathing in sync. They were like sentinels. They were like soldiers manning a barricade. The fear in Christine's gut began to curdle. It was changing. It was twisting from terror into something else. Something hot. Something jagged. Why must we be afraid? The voice in her head whispered. Why must we always tremble? We work. We slave. And for what? To be hunted? The shadows lengthened. The house grew colder. The clock in the hallway ticked, each second a hammer blow. Tick, tock, tick, tock. They were counting down the moments of their lives. Christine looked at Léa. In the gloom, her sister's face was a pale oval, eyes wide and trusting. Christine knew she had to protect that face. She had to stop the patron from hurting them. She had to stop the separation. The paranoia had reached its peak. The world was coming to get them, and the only way out was through. They stood on that landing for hours. Can you imagine the tension? Standing in the dark, muscles coiled, ears straining for the sound of a key in the lock. They were not planning a murder. Not yet. They were waiting for a judgment. They were waiting for the monster to come home. And then, just after 6 p.m., they heard it. The sound of a car engine. The slam of a door. Footsteps on the pavement. The heavy, confident click of the front door latch. The Lancelins were home. The lights were out. The stage was set. The front door groaned open, admitting a gust of damp February air and the two women, wrapped in their heavy coats. Madame Lancelin entered first, her presence immediately filling the hallway, followed closely by Genevieve. They stepped into the abyss. Imagine their confusion. They expected the warm glow of the electric lights, the smell of dinner, the orderly hum of their well-kept home. Instead, they walked into a cave. The darkness was absolute, save for the faint, gray light bleeding in from the street lamps outside. The silence was thick, pressing against their ears like water. Christine, Madame Lancelin's voice rang out. It wasn't a scream, not yet. It was the sharp, annoyed tone of a mistress inconvenienced. Léa? Why is it dark? What is the meaning of this? There was no answer from the kitchen, no scurrying of feet, no apologetic murmur, just the heavy, wooden silence of the house. Madame Lancelin, fueled by that specific irritation reserved for the wealthy when their comforts are disrupted, began to move. She didn't retreat. She didn't sense the danger vibrating in the air. She marched forward, her heels clicking aggressively on the parquet floor, Genevieve trailing in her wake like a nervous shadow. They moved toward the stairs. Up above, on the landing, two hearts were beating so hard they threatened to crack ribs. Christine and Léa stood frozen, their hands clenched at their sides. They watched the two dark shapes detach themselves from the shadows of the hallway and begin the ascent. Thump, thump, thump. As the Lancelins climbed, the dim light from the window on the landing revealed the sisters. They were standing side by side, blocking the path, like twin gargoyles guarding a gate. Madame Lancelin stopped a few steps below them. She looked up, her face a mask of indignation in the gloom. "Well?" she demanded, her breath pluming faintly in the cold air. "What is going on? Why are there no lights?" Christine spoke. Her voice was not the meek whisper of the maid. It was tight, high-pitched, vibrating with the tension of the last 6 years. "The iron," she said. "The iron broke. The fuse blew. The iron." Madame Lancelin repeated, incredulous. "You broke the iron? And you have left us in the dark?" It happened then. The invisible wire that held Christine's sanity together finally snapped. It wasn't a conscious decision. It wasn't a plan. It was a chemical reaction. The tone of Madame's voice, that disdain, that accusation, hit the pool of paranoia in Christine's mind and ignited it. She didn't see her employer anymore. She didn't see a woman. She saw a demon. She saw the jaws of the orphanage opening up to swallow them. She saw the hands reaching out to tear her away from Léa. Christine didn't shout back. She didn't apologize. She moved. With a speed that defied logic, Christine lunged. She didn't reach for a weapon, not yet. She used what she had. She leaped from the landing, launching herself through the air like a wild animal, colliding with Madame Lancelin. The impact was brutal. There was no grace in it, only the raw, chaotic energy of survival. Genevieve screamed, a high, thin sound that was cut short as the violence spilled over. "Léa, help me," Christine shrieked. It was a command from the Alpha, the general calling her soldier to war. Tear them. Smash them. Léa, who had never disobeyed a direct order in her life, threw herself into the fray. She attacked Genevieve. The landing became a swirling vortex of skirts, limbs, and guttural noises. And then, the horror truly began. The thing that separates this crime from 1,000 others. The thing that makes seasoned detectives vomit. Christine, straddling the stunned Madame Lancelin, didn't punch or strangle. She reached down with her fingers, her strong, scrubbing fingers, and drove them into the woman's face. She went for the eyes. It was primal. It was specific. With a sickening wet sound, she gouged. She tore. She ripped the sight right out of her oppressor. It was as if she needed to ensure that the patron could never watch them again. No more white glove. No more staring at the dust. No more judging eyes. Madame Lancelin shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that echoed off the high ceilings, and then fell back, blinded, blood masking her face. "Do it, Léa. Do it," Christine howled. Léa, grappling with Genevieve, mimicked her sister. She drove her fingers into the young girl's eyes. Genevieve, weaker, softer, crumpled under the assault. In seconds, the Lancelin women, who had walked into their home 5 minutes ago as masters of their domain, were reduced to blinded, writhing heaps on the floorboards. The darkness of the house was now matched by the darkness of their world. They could not see the monsters standing over them, but they could hear them. They could hear the heavy, ragged breathing of the maids. They could hear the shuffle of feet as the sisters stood up, looking down at their handiwork. But it wasn't over. Oh no, the beast was awake now, and it was not satisfied with just darkness. It wanted silence. It wanted the twitching to stop. Christine turned, her hands wet and trembling. She looked around the landing. She needed something heavier than hands. She needed to finish it. She ran back towards the kitchen, her footsteps thundering. She wasn't running away. She was looking for tools. She found the pewter pitcher. Heavy, solid, and she found a knife. She returned to the landing where Léa was standing guard over the moaning women. Christine handed the heavy pewter pitcher to her sister. The metal was cold. The handle was firm. "Finish it," Christine whispered. The darkness on the landing was no longer empty. It was thick with the copper. Scent of blood. The only sounds were the ragged, wet gasps of the Lancelin women writhing on the floorboards and the terrifying, synchronized breathing of the sisters standing above them. Christine held the heavy pewter pitcher. It was a decorative thing, meant for serving wine or water at civilized dinners. Now, in her grip, it was a bludgeon. She looked down at the patron. Madame Lancelin was no longer the imposing figure of authority. She was a broken doll, her face a ruin of red where her eyes had been. But she was still moving. She was still alive. And to Christine, that meant the threat remained. That meant the separation could still happen. "They are not dead, Léa," Christine whispered. Her voice was unrecognizable, a guttural croak. "We must make sure. We must finish it." She swung. The sound of heavy pewter striking bone is not a sound you ever want to hear. It is dull, wet, and final. Christine brought the pitcher down on Madame Lancelin's head with the force of 7 years of repressed rage. Crack. That was for the inspections. Crack. That was for the silence. Crack. That was for looking at us like we were dirt. Léa, holding a heavy hammer that Christine had thrust into her hand from the utility closet, stood over Genevieve. The girl was whimpering, a high, thin sound of pure terror. Léa didn't hesitate. She didn't look at the girl she had served for years. She looked at a target. She swung the hammer. It became a frenzy. It ceased to be an assault and became an obliteration. They didn't just want to kill the women. They wanted to erase them. They wanted to smash the very faces that had judged them. The sisters worked in a terrifying rhythm, a macabre dance in the dark. Thud, thud, thud. Blood began to spray. It wasn't just a trickle, it was a fountain. It splashed against the floral wallpaper. It soaked into the expensive carpet. It speckled the pristine white aprons of the maids, turning them into butchers. Christine was possessed. She dropped the dented pitcher and grabbed the kitchen knife she had brought up. She fell upon the body of Madame Lancelin. She stabbed, but not with precision. She stabbed with fury. She slashed at the legs, the buttocks, the face. It was an act of total desecration. She was carving her hatred into the flesh of her employer. "Harder, Léa! Harder!" she shrieked. "Smash her!" Léa obeyed. She rained blows down on Genevieve's head until the girl's skull collapsed, until there was nothing left to recognize. The hammer rose and fell, a metronome of death. The violence went on for 30 minutes. Think about that. 30 minutes. Usually, a murder is quick, a gunshot, a moment of passion. This was work. This was manual labor. They beat the bodies until they were unrecognizable pulp. They beat them until the faces were just massed craters of bone and tissue. They beat them until the pewter pitcher was flattened and the knife blade was bent. The hallway was slick with gore. In the dim light, it looked like an abattoir. The sisters were slipping in it, their shoes making wet, squelching noises as they moved around the bodies, attacking from different angles to ensure the job was done. And then, finally, the movement on the floor stopped. The Lancelin women were gone. What lay on the landing were just heaps of meat and cloth. The silence rushed back into the house, louder than before. It was a ringing silence, punctuated only by the dripping of blood and the sisters' own heartbeats. Christine stood up, her chest heaving. Her hair was wild, plastered to her forehead with sweat and blood. She looked at the carnage. She didn't look horrified. She didn't scream. She looked relieved. "It is done," she panted. "They cannot hurt us now. They cannot separate us." Léa dropped the hammer. It landed with a dull thud on the blood-soaked carpet. She looked at her hands. They were red to the wrists. She looked at Christine. "Is it over?" "Yes," Christine said, wiping a smear of blood from her cheek. "It is over. We have won." They stood there for a moment, two dark silhouettes amidst the ruin of a bourgeois life. They were the masters of the house now. They had conquered the enemy. But as the adrenaline began to fade, the cold reality of the house started to seep back in. The bodies were cooling. The blood was congealing. And outside, the world was still turning. Christine looked down at her apron. "We are dirty, Léa," she said, her voice dropping back to a whisper. "We must clean up. Not the floor. The floor stays. But us. We must be clean." They stepped over the bodies of the women they had served. They didn't look down with regret. They stepped over them like you might step over a pile of laundry. They walked up the remaining stairs, leaving bloody footprints on the wood, heading toward the sanctuary of their attic room. The slaughter was finished. The madness was just beginning. They turned their backs on the carnage. The bodies of Madame Lancelin and Genevieve lay twisted on the landing, a grotesque heap of shattered bone and bloody fabric, but the sisters did not look back. They had a new task now. The work was done. Now came the tidying. It is a chilling testament to their psychology that they reverted instantly to their roles as efficient servants. Christine picked up the hammer and the knife. They were slick, dripping, offensive objects. She carried them not like evidence, but like dirty cutlery. They descended the stairs, stepping carefully to avoid the pools of blood, and went into the kitchen. The house was still pitch black, save for the faint gray light from the street. In the shadows of the scullery, Christine washed the hammer. She scrubbed the handle. She rinsed the blade of the knife. She dried them with a cloth and put them away. The hammer went back to the shelf. The knife went back to the drawer. Everything in its place. A place for everything. Then, the locking up. Christine was the general of this fortress. She moved to the front door, the heavy oak barrier that separated their world from the street. She turned the key. Click. She slid the heavy iron bolt. Thud. She fastened the safety chain. Rattle. Now. She whispered to the dark hallway. Now no one can come in. They had sealed themselves inside with their dead. Most murderers flee. They run into the night, terrified of what they have done. The Papin sisters did the opposite. They locked the world out. They claimed the house. For the first time in 7 years, they were the absolute masters of 6 Rue Bruyere. They climbed the stairs again, past the silent, cooling mounds of flesh on the landing, and went up to the top floor. To their attic. The room was freezing. The heat from the main house rarely reached up here, and the February night was seeping through the roof tiles. They lit a single candle. The small flame danced, casting long, wavering shadows against the sloping ceiling. Take off your dress, Léa, Christine commanded softly. They stripped. The white aprons, stiff with dried blood, were peeled off. The dark woolen dresses, stained and damp, fell to the floor. They stood naked in the freezing room, 2 pale ghosts shivering in the candlelight. There was a pitcher of water and a basin on the dresser. They washed. The water in the basin turned pink, then dark red, as they scrubbed the evidence of their crime from their skin. They washed each other's backs. They washed their hands, scrubbing at the cuticles where the blood had settled deep. It was a baptism of sorts. They were washing away the maids, washing away the servants, leaving only the sisters. When they were clean, they put on their nightgowns. Simple, white cotton gowns. They looked like children. They looked like innocent girls ready for a bedtime story, not women who had just bludgeoned 2 people to death 20 feet away. Come, Christine said. They climbed into the single iron bed. It was narrow, barely wide enough for one, let alone 2. But they fit. They always fit. They curled. Together, spoons in a drawer, limbs tangling to share warmth. Christine wrapped her arms around Léa. Léa buried her face in Christine's chest. Are they dead? Léa asked, her voice muffled by the cotton. Yes, Christine stroked her sister's hair. They are dead. They can never scold us again. And the monsieur? Léa asked. He will come home. Yes, Christine replied, her eyes open, staring at the flickering candle flame. He will come, and we will wait. They lay there in the silence. The house below them was a slaughterhouse. The smell of copper and death was beginning to drift up the stairs, a heavy, metallic tang mixing with the smell of their cheap soap. But in that bed, there was a terrifying peace. They didn't pack a bag. They didn't plan an escape route. They didn't try to concoct a lie. They simply waited. It was a regression. They had become the little girls in the orphanage again, hiding under the covers, waiting for the footsteps of the authority figure. They had done something bad, and now they would wait to be found. Downstairs, the clock chimed. 7 o'clock. Monsieur Lancelin would be arriving soon. He would put his key in the lock, He would find the door bolted. He would knock, and he would get no answer. The sisters lay still, listening to the wind rattle the roof tiles. They were suspended in time. The act of violence had purged the rage from their systems, leaving them hollow and light. They weren't afraid of the police. They weren't afraid of prison. They were together. The door was locked. The world was outside. "Close your eyes, Léa," Christine whispered. "Rest now." And so, surrounded by the invisible ghosts of their victims, the Papin sisters closed their eyes and waited for the end of the world. The wind bit at Monsieur René Lancelin's face as he walked down Rue Bruyère. It was past 6:30 p.m. He was a man of routine, expecting the comforts of his station, a warm house, a laid table, the quiet deference of his wife and daughter. But as he approached number 6, something was wrong. The house was a slab of blackness against the night sky. No light in the parlor. No glow from the kitchen. He frowned, gripping his keys. Perhaps a fuse, he thought, echoing the very event that had started the nightmare. He stepped up to the heavy oak door and slid his key into the lock. It turned, but the door didn't budge. Bolted from the inside. He knocked. The sound was hollow, swallowed instantly by the heavy masonry. "Léonie? Geneviève?" Silence. He stepped back, looking up at the facade. The windows were dead eyes staring back at him. Except, way up high, in the attic dormer, a faint, flickering orange glow. A candle. The maids were there. A cold prickle of unease started at the base of his neck. Why would the maids be in the attic with a candle while the house was bolted shut? Where was his family? René Lancelin was not a man given to panic, but the silence of the house was aggressive. It felt wrong. He ran to the home of his brother-in-law, Monsieur Renard. "Something is happening," he told him, his breath coming in short bursts. "The house is locked. I cannot get in." They returned together, bringing a police commissioner with them. The authority of the law now stood before the silent fortress. They banged on the door. "Open up. Police." Nothing. The house held its breath. Finally, an officer scaled the back wall, breaking through a window to gain entry. The air inside was stale and freezing. The officer fumbled for a light, his boots crunching on the quiet floorboards of the kitchen. He unlocked the front door, letting the men in. "Hello," Lancelin called out. "Léonie." They moved through the ground floor. The kitchen was empty. The dining room was empty. The furniture sat in judgment, silent witnesses to the nothingness. The darkness was absolute, so they lit matches and a single flashlight, the beams cutting through the gloom like knives. They began to climb the stairs. The beam of the flashlight swept up the wooden steps. First, it caught the banister. Then, a stain on the wall. A dark smear. The policeman paused. He swept the light higher. On the landing, the beam hit a pile of rags. "What is that?" someone whispered. They moved closer, and the rags resolved into shapes. Human shapes. But they were wrong. They were twisted, broken things. The men stopped. The breath punched out of their lungs. The flashlight beam trembled as it played over the horror. There lay Madame Lancelin and Geneviève. But they were not just dead. They had been butchered. Their faces were obliterated. The eyes were gone, leaving gaping, bloody sockets that seemed to stare into the very souls of the men. The carpet was a swamp of blood. Brain matter and bone fragments were scattered like confetti across the floorboards. Monsieur Lancelin let out a sound, a strangled, animal noise of pure despair, and collapsed. He couldn't look. No husband, no father, should ever see such a thing. The police were hardened men, veterans of the Great War, but even they recoiled. "My God," the commissioner muttered, crossing himself. "Who did this? Where are the maids?" The thought raced through their minds. The maids must be dead too. A maniac has broken in. A gang. Someone has slaughtered the whole household. Guns drawn, hearts hammering against their ribs, the officers stepped over the mangled bodies. They moved up the second flight of stairs, toward the attic, toward that faint, flickering candle they had seen from the street. The attic door was closed. The commissioner approached it slowly. He gripped the handle. He expected another slaughter. He expected to find Christine and Léa with their throats cut, victims of the same monster downstairs. He threw the door open. The sight that greeted them was so surreal, so utterly disjointed from the carnage below, that for a moment they couldn't process it. There was no blood here, no chaos. The room was tidy. A single candle burned on a plate, and there, in the narrow iron bed, lay the two sisters. They were under the covers, wearing their white nightgowns. They were pressed together, Christine's arm protectively over Léa. They looked for all the world like two children who had been tucked in for the night. They blinked in the sudden harsh light of the flashlights. They didn't scream. They didn't reach for weapons. Christine sat up slightly, her face calm, almost serene. She looked at the police officers, at the guns, at the terror in their eyes. "The maids," the commissioner stammered, confused. "Are you hurt?" "No, monsieur," Christine said softly. "Who did this?" the officer demanded. "Who is downstairs?" Christine looked him in the eye. There was no remorse, no fear, just the flat, cold fact of it. "We did," she said. The silence that followed was heavier than the silence of the grave. The officers stared at these two small women in their nightgowns, unable to reconcile them with the butchers who had used a pewter pitcher to crush skulls. "You?" the commissioner whispered. "Yes," Christine replied, pulling the blanket up a little higher. "We did it. Is the monsieur home?" "He is downstairs," the officer said, his voice shaking. "Good." Christine nodded, laying her head back down on the pillow next to her sister. "Then he knows." They offered no resistance. When the handcuffs came out, they simply held out their wrists. They were lifted from the warm bed, two sleepwalkers waking up into a nightmare they had created. As they were led out of the room, past the basin of pink water, past the scrubbed hammer, they didn't look back. They were led down the stairs, past the bodies of the women they had destroyed, and out into the cold night air where the crowds were already gathering. The pearls of Rue Bruyère were pearls no more. They were the monsters of France. The iron doors of the prison slammed shut, but for Christine and Léa, the real punishment wasn't the stone walls or the barred windows. It was the space between them. For the first time in their lives, they were put in separate cells. You might think the trial was the spectacle. And oh, it was. France was set on fire by the story. The newspapers couldn't print the editions fast enough. The monsters of Le Mans. The wolves. But the intellectuals, the philosophers, the surrealists, they saw something else. They saw a dark rebellion. They saw the working class rising up to slaughter the bourgeoisie. They turned the sisters into icons of class warfare. But Christine and Léa didn't care about class warfare. They didn't care about politics. Sitting in the dock in September 1933, dressed in borrowed clothes, they looked like terrified children. They didn't listen to the lawyers. They only had eyes for each other. When they were allowed to sit near one another, they would lean in, their shoulders touching, whispering in that secret language of theirs, oblivious to the judge, the jury, and the crowd calling for their heads. Christine took the blame. Of course she did. She was the mother sister. I did it, she told the judge, her voice flat. Léa only did what I told her. But the law is a cold machine. It saw two butchers. The verdict was swift. Christine was sentenced to death, later commuted to life imprisonment. But to her, it was all the same. Léa, considered the follower, the shadow, was given 10 years of hard labor. And then came the true execution. They were dragged apart. This is where the horror turns inward. In the prison of Rennes, Christine went mad. Truly, violently mad. Without Léa, she was an amputee. She was half a soul trying to survive in a whole body. She refused to eat. She screamed for her sister until her throat bled. She stripped off her prison clothes and huddled naked in the corner, hallucinating that they were back in the attic, that the Lancelins were coming to get them. She wrote letters, frantic, scribbled things. My beloved Léa, they are killing me. I am alone. The separation did what the orphanage. And the servitude never could. It broke her. Christine Papin, the fierce protector, the woman who had gouged out eyes to save her sister, withered away. She starved herself. She drifted into a catatonic state, a living ghost haunting her own cell. In 1937, for years after the murders, she died in an asylum. She was 32 years old. The official cause was cachexia, wasting away. But really, she died of a broken connection. She died because the other half of her was gone. And Léa? Léa was the survivor. But what is survival when you are the shadow? She served her time. She was a model prisoner, quiet, obedient, hardworking. The perfect maid, even in jail. She was released in 1941 into a France occupied by Nazis, a world that had forgotten the horror of the Rue Bruyere in the face of a much larger war. She didn't disappear into the ether. She went back to the only life she knew. She lived under a false name. And where did she work? In hotels. In houses. She went back to cleaning. Can you imagine? Checking into a hotel in Nantes, and the old woman scrubbing your floor, the quiet one with the downcast eyes. Is Léa Papin? The woman who hammered a girl's skull to pieces? She lived a long time. Too long, perhaps. She lived with her mother, Clemence, the very monster who had started it all, until Clemence died. Then she lived alone. She grew old. She grew gray. She watched television. She ate her meals. She never spoke of Christine. She never spoke of the eyes. Léa Papin died in 1982. She was 70 years old. She died in a hospital bed, a frail, solitary woman who looked like anybody's grandmother. When she died, she took the final secrets of that night with her. They are buried separately now. Christine in the asylum plot, Léa in a family grave. But I like to think that the house on Rue Bruyere still remembers them. I like to think that if you stand on that landing in the dark and you listen very closely, you can still hear it. Not the screams, not the blows, but the sound of two hearts beating as one, and the whisper that started it all. They will not separate us. And in the end, perhaps they won. Because here we are, nearly 100 years later, and we are still talking about them. We are still afraid of them. They are together in the history books, fused forever in the amber of their crime. Sleep well, and check the locks.